Welcome to How the World Works. I'm Kevin Williamson, writer in residence here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and national correspondent for the Dispatch. This is a podcast where we talk about work, we talk about our jobs we've had, the jobs we currently have, how we got into it, the role of work in our lives, in the economy and society more broadly. And we try to take the subject of work seriously in a way that it's often not. I have as a guest today John Guaspari, Guspari rather, I'm sorry, who is a writer whose name you may have seen in the Dispatch or National Review or a few places. But John has done something that I have not done as a writer that I think my publishers and my agent and my children very much wish I would do, which is, John, you wrote a book that sold, if I'm correct in remembering, 400,000 copies?
So I'm told, something of that order. Yeah.
Tell
Yeah.
me about
Yeah. This was, it was a book on, of course, the topic was one that people would just rush to their bookstores would buy. It was about total quality management.
it. TQM, big deal back
Yeah.
in sort of 90s?
Uh, Early 80s through the 90s, depending
Okay.
on the industry. TQM kind of made landfall in the United States in the auto industry when Toyota, and to a lesser known degree, company Datsun, which is now Nissan, started delivering cars to the United States that worked. And unlike there were the big three American automakers, Ford, Chrysler, GM at the time, made cars that, don't hold me to the number, but this is roughly right, something on the order of, in the first 6 months of new car ownership, you could expect something on the order of 5.6 to 5.8 warranty repairable defects. So you'd buy the car, a month and a half later, something would go wrong. You'd call the dealer. They'd say, bring it on in, no problem. We'll fix it at no cost to you, notwithstanding that the bringing it on in is a cost. But we accepted it because that's what it meant to buy a new car. And if you recall at the time, or those of your listeners who are old enough to recall, that's how they competed on warranty: 10-year, 10,000 miles, 20-year, 20,000 miles, so on and so forth. And
I don't recall any 20-year warranties. There.
Maybe I've got the numbers wrong, but I'm sorry, 5-year, 50,000 mile. I got an extra zero in there.
Yeah.
But then along came these companies that made cars that didn't break. BREAK, break.
Yes.
And
we had some of the kind that didn't BRAKE too, but that's a whole different story of TQM.
But this was unfair, and what had happened was that the TQM movement, which had its the high priests of TQM, W. Edwards Deming, Joseph M. Duran, were preaching it to Detroit in the 60s and the 50s, and they just weren't listening. And there were good reasons they weren't listening.
So for the listeners who are not familiar with this, would you give us a brief précis on what total quality management is, where it came from, and what its precepts are?
Well, total quality management, it's one of the basic tenets of total quality management is that the earlier you find a defect in a manufacturing process, the cheaper it is to fix. It's always better to, and this is really key, that you ought not to focus on the thing that you're trying to fix. If you're truly enlightened, you should pull back and view the process by which the thing is built. Because if in the limit you have a process that is robust and reliable and repeatable enough, you shouldn't need to test all that often. in the limit, you shouldn't need tests at all. In theory, you could take raw material in at one end, you have this wonderful process, and out comes finished product, and you'd ship it to the customer with no problems.
So give me an example, a concrete example of how this would have been applied in, say, automobile manufacturing. Like, what is something, a problem that would be discovered, and how would it be treated and analyzed and dealt with?
Well, it might be, I can speak more knowledgeably about the electronics industry because that's where I work, if I might. Electronics industry, for example, you would, a company that made product with electronics components would buy a bunch of resistors, capacitors, inductors, and they'd buy slews of these things, and they would test them at incoming inspection because they wouldn't want them to get into the production process and pollute the production process. And then once they'd made it through that test, they'd be loaded onto printed circuit boards. So they'd have a printed circuit board, but before a printed circuit board went into a subassembly or a finish assembly, you'd want to test the printed circuit board so that it didn't pollute the higher value-added good that was the subassembly or finished assembly. And finally, if something got out into the field, you'd want to have a means of testing it in the field so that, that's not great, but you'd want to be able to equip your service technicians with a box they go out in the field with, do a test, just swap the board out, put in a new board, and the customer would be made whole again. So that's kind of how those principles were applied. But again, the goal ideally would have been to not have any testing at all, yet you needed to do some. That was the assumption. Life isn't perfect.
The way things would work is they would just sort of get the components, put them in, make the product, hope it worked, and if it didn't, start to figure out what the problem is.
Yeah, it'd be a little bit more rigorous than that, but yeah, I mean, they would do their best to that was kind of do your best was kind of the watchword of quality in a less refined, less enlightened era. But then along came TQM, which said, well, no, the goal ought to be zero defects, and you ought to be able to do it. And again, the way you get to zero defects is not so much focusing on the product, but focusing on the process. Well, how I came to write that book was, at the time, I worked for a company that made automatic test equipment. We made the testers that tested things at incoming inspection and tested things at printed circuit board test and tested things in field service test. And we were thriving in the late 70s and early 80s because TQM hadn't quite made landfall yet in the electronics industry. It was already busy mucking up the auto industry. But then it did hit the electronics industry, and TQM was saying, you shouldn't need to test. And we made testers. And you didn't have to be Peter Drucker to realize that this was of serious strategic significance to us. So I worked at the time, my job was manager of corporate marketing programs. And this was a long time ago, so don't ask me to tell you what that meant. And I suspect if you had asked me back then what that meant, I probably couldn't have told you, because it was one of those corporate jobs that, that just kind of sort of was a job. I worked hard at it and I think did useful work, but
somebody must be some kind of genius short form poetic writer who comes up with these perfectly bland corporate job titles.
Oh yeah. That was probably a job title.
It sounds like it says something, but doesn't actually say anything. I love that.
There was probably a corporate job moniker, director of corporate job monikerization. So there it was. There. I just made one up.
Yeah, very good.
So I got immersed in this stuff. I said it probably behooved me to learn something about this. So I read whatever I get my hands on, talked to whoever would be willing to talk to me, visited some customers, went, viewed whatever training videos might have been available. In those days, they were on VHS, so you had to find them and get them. You know, it wasn't just a couple of mouse clicks away. I went to conferences, I went to seminars, and I actually had the occasion, I actually had the privilege of going to what was known then as a Deming 4-day. Now, you heard of W. Edwards Deming.
Go ahead and explain his significance to the listeners.
W. Edwards Deming was one of the, I kind of half jokingly, but there's a fair bit of truth to this, was the Babe Ruth of the total quality management movement. He was one of many men. There were others. William Schuart was the father of statistical process control, which is kind of the statistical basis behind TQM. There was a man named Joseph M. Duran, who was a statistician who had worked at Bell Labs with Deming. There was later came a man named Phil Crosby, who wrote a book called Quality is Free, which, God forbid, was actually readable, which made him a bit of an outcast in that world.
So Deming's short biography is his background.
Deming, he was actually a musician and a physicist, and I believe a physicist and a statistician. He was from Iowa, and just a crusty old bird, and came to the world of TQM and found that this stuff was important, and he tried to preach it early on in the days of before it was called TQM, and he tried to preach it in Detroit and was not listened to in the 50s and the 60s, because by God, the big three stood astride the world, and we don't need advice from this cornball from Iowa. And he went to Japan and taught them. And they had the advantage, and I'm saying advantage in italics, of having had their industrial base ruined. And so they could start from scratch. They said, okay, we'll listen. And it was easier. You know, now they talk about, you know, a greenfield approach. It wasn't quite green maybe in Japan, but you know, if you start with a greenfield, you're starting with a blank slate, you can build things according to these principles. So they could, and they did. And there were certain cultural appurtenances to the way Japanese lived that made them more agreeable to the kind of approach to quality, which is less is more and smaller is better and all those kinds of things. And they followed these, and you know, because it used to be that the little tag on a product that said made in Japan was the mark of poor quality.
Right.
And not long after that, that became the mark of good quality.
It was made in China of its time.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got a guy from Iowa. He has some big ideas. He tries to sell them to the American automotive industry. The American automotive industry at that point is riding high. Feels like it doesn't need the advice. He goes to Japan. The Japanese take him up on it and come and kick the snot out of the American automotive industry in the 1980s.
Right. So now Deming, this is in the 1980s. Now, it was always easy to remember how old Deming was because he was born in 1900. So this would have been 1983, I think 83. So he's 83 years old. And one of the seminars I went to was what was called the Deming 4-day. And so it was a 4-day seminar taught by Dr. Deming. And he was on the platform for 4 days. And I later in my career had occasion to deliver 1-day seminars. And I remember how exhausted I was at the end of a day. And he was up there for 4 days. Occasionally somebody get up there for half an hour, but he was up there for pretty much the whole time. Now, he had all the credibility in the world. I yield to him, absolutely, utterly credible, everything he was saying. One of the reasons he was able to do it for 4 days was he didn't put a lot of effort into trying to engage the audience. He was crusty and didn't care. And just sort of spewed out the technology of this. And I can remember on day one of the seminar, a guy. Oh, before I get that, I walked in on day. I sat down. It was in the Sheraton Boston, huge ballroom, probably table set up for about 300 people. I found a place at a table, like you do with these things. And I turned to the guy at my left and introduced myself. I turned to the guy at my right. It was David Halberstam, who was there researching the book which would become The Reckoning, which was the book he wrote about how Ford turned around their manufacturing to quality is job one and that whole thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just found that, my goodness, it's David Halberstam. What's he doing next to me? But on day one of the seminar, a guy raised his hand in the audience, and Deming sounded a little bit like Richard Nixon. So forgive me, but so he said, "Do you have a question?" And the guy said, "Yeah," and he asked this question, and Deming said, "Well, I now have a question for you. Are you a manager?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "Well, then you ought to be fired, because if that's the way your brain works, you're a menace to your company." There weren't many more questions asked for the rest of the 4 days. And that kind of helped crystallize for me something it had begun to roil around in my head as I was doing all my reading and look at this, because one of the other tenets of total quality is that quality is not just the job of the quality department. Quality is everybody's job. And I begun to look at all this stuff, and the books on quality were these 650-page tomes of statistical process control. And I had a technical background, so I could understand it, but everybody didn't need to understand all that stuff. There was way more. You didn't need to go be browbeaten by Dr. Deming for 4 days. The way I used it later on in my career when I was teaching about this stuff, I would say to people, I care a great deal about my health. I need to know my weight, my blood pressure, my cholesterol level, and my doctor's phone number. I don't need medical texts. I don't need a medical degree. It's probably not a good thing that I have access to WebMD. And similarly, there weren't ways to engage people in this very important topic that TQM was telling us everybody needed to be engaged in. So that's where I got the idea to write what I started out as saying. I started out as an engineer, and so it was the engineer in me that I actually started writing a book with design criteria, which was probably horrify most writers, but it had to be very short, readable under an hour. It had to be about a company that made something, not service quality, because you had to be able to see it. It couldn't, it had to be something like a widget that broke so you could see it.
So your idea was to take Deming's approach and give it to people without a 4-day seminar in which they would have to endure personal abuse.
And they could read this book in 45 minutes and get the core message in a way that's easy, clean, and maybe even a little bit fun. God forbid,
And that book was called?
It was called I Know It When I See It. And I wrote it, and it sold, and I was stunned that I found an agent and that he found a publisher, and that it really stunned that it sold well. And I started getting phone calls from people to give speeches and so on. I said, "No, thank you, but no, I have a job." And
were you surprised when the sales really started to take off?
Oh, good Lord, yes. I was stunned.
Years ago, I met this guy who was a songwriter, and he's written a lot of songs, and one of the songs he wrote was Baby Blue, which became a hit for George Strait back when. And he'd originally written that song with James Taylor in mind, and James Taylor had no interest in the song and didn't want to record it. And this fellow was not a country guy. He'd never heard of George Strait, but he gets a call from his agent, and the agent says, "This guy George Strait's going to record your song," and that's that. So he figures, well, my house is about to get foreclosed on anyway. I desperately need some money, and so anything's better than nothing. So he signs the deal. And when his first check comes in, he calls his agent up, and he says, "I think there's a mistake that there's more zeros on this check than there probably ought to be." And he really seriously thought it was a misprint from the bank, which did happen from time to time. Um, and his agent tells him no, and you're gonna get another one like it next quarter and the quarter after that, and
Yeah.
it's gonna be a while. And that kind of changed his life. Or for some, being from Lubbock, Texas, I know a lot of songwriters. The lady who wrote "Wide Open Spaces," which became a big hit for the Dixie Chicks, similar kind of
Yeah.
experience. Although I think she was maybe a little more in tune, that she understood she had a big thing on her hand. I unfortunately have not had the experience of seeing one of my books have runaway sales that I wasn't
Well,
expecting. So in my business, if you sell in the political books, 25,000 is a real good number. You sell
yeah.
25,000 books, you've done a pretty good job. So 400,000, how many languages and such?
I 6 or 7. I don't
Mm.
know. And the thing is that the gimmick, if that's the right word, I don't like to think of it as a gimmick, but I was trying to think of I wanted to make it about a company that made something, but it couldn't be a real product because then that would, well, yeah, if you make, you know, smartphones, but not if you make computer keyboards. Uh, and I was trying to think of something that might work. And like a lot of things, I remember the moment I thought of the idea. I was playing on the floor of our living room with our son, who was then 3 years old, and it hit me. It would be a company that made punctuation marks. And that if you wanted to speak or write, you needed to buy punctuation marks from them. Because if you didn't buy punctuation marks, your sentences would sound like this, and the next one would sound like this, and they'd all run on and on. You know, you get the point. And then once you had the idea, it'd be easy to see that if the hook broke off a comma instead of a pause, you come to a abrupt stop, and that could cause rhetorical whiplash and silly stuff like that. But it worked.
So you've written a
And
lot of things that with fables in mind.
uh, a couple of fables. I wrote one book that was a murder mystery, whereas it sopped my audience. The murder victim was the consultant. I thought they'd like that.
Please,
Um,
everyone.
I tried to tell stories, and because storytelling works.
Yeah.
And I always I wound up one way or another is carving out a niche because I did have, again, I had a technical background. So I carved out a niche for myself as being the guy who could talk or write about technical stuff in a way that was accessible.
Yeah.
And um, but
Yeah.
the
I
thing
want to
about,
some of your
oh, go
early
ahead.
and education stuff here in a second, but before we do, one thing, the fight I want to start with you, which I
Oh,
was thinking about since we started talking about doing this conversation, which is that now I've not read your books, so I take that under advice, and I've not read any TQ1 books at all. But I'm just deeply, deeply skeptical of business management books as a genre.
I,
I have a very deep belief that every business is different from every other business, and the idea of coming up with sort of general principles is iffy at best. So you coming from a libertarian background, like everyone who's been a semi-professional libertarian in life, at one point worked for a nonprofit, largely supported by the Koch Foundation. And at the time when you worked at a Koch Foundation aligned group, you got assigned reading that was Charles Koch's management book called The Science of Success. And it's a fine book as far as such books go. But having read that book and talked to him about it a little bit, I don't believe there is any such thing as a science of success or a science of management. The Koch story is a story that starts with a very particular set of circumstances, which is inheriting an oil company from your parents. And step one is that's a good step to start with.
Step one.
Now, granted, what the Kochs did with that little company was remarkable. They built this gigantic global enterprise out of it, and I'm not at all pissing on them as business people, but it's just a set of circumstances that's not replicable for people. So you can't read a book and say, okay, well, once I inherit the oil company from my parents, now I know what to do. So why should I suspend my skepticism for TQM?
I think TQM, well, yes and no. It depends on whom you read. And I don't mean me. I'm talking about the broad principles of TQM are merely statistical process control principles that I think are broadly applicable. That you need to understand how your processes work. You need to get them under statistical process control. You need to understand what that means. You need to understand how to manage accordingly. When you begin to get out too far away from that center and people begin to get into what is technically referred to as the woo-woo stuff associated with it, that then your skepticism should start to go up, and people start coming up with all kinds of fancy models about this or that, and yeah, I mean the stuff that gets into the behavioral models, it's not unuseful in some circumstances, but I've always been a little suspicious of that. I mean, my last job for which I had a W-2, I was in HR. God help me. I feel like I need to go to confession after we finish
Center of
this.
all evil is HR. Yeah.
Yeah. But it was not in the kind of administrative HR kind of job, but but I get all that. But I think it depends on what they're selling.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're selling some kind of hard technical principles that are pretty rigorous and pretty repeatable and provable, then that's okay. But if it's the woo-woo stuff, I'd raise an eyebrow too.
Well, maybe later I'll shake you down for some TQM advice on editing and proofreading digital magazine copy. The one process that I have a lot of experience in, and some people do better jobs at than others, and I think we do a pretty good job of the dispatch. But there's room for improvement.
Stuff slides through.
Yeah, every now and then. I write a lot, so it's hard for me to catch everything in my own stuff. So you grew up in sort of late 1950s, early 1960s, kind of a Ozzie and Harriet background. Tell me a little bit about your childhood and education, and what point of view.
Yeah, I grew up. I was born in 1950. I grew up in a city, Rome, New York, which is right in the dead geographical center of New York State, near Syracuse, 35 miles from Syracuse, 10 miles from Utica. It was a classic Rust Belt town. I mean, now it's Rust Belt. Then it was a thriving factory town.
What was the factory?
Revere Copper and Brass, the copper bottom pots and pans. Mm-hmm. These other factories, not so well known, but their names tell you with it. Rome Cable, Spargo Wire. I mean, heavy industry that made cables and wire, and the fathers of a lot of my friends worked in those factories. And we also had Griffiths Air Force Base was a SAC base in Rome, until it was closed in the round of base closings in the mid-90s, whenever that was. And then somebody thought it would be a great idea to have the Woodstock 25th anniversary of Woodstock there, and that's that hellacious Woodstock thing that happened. Yeah, that was there. They said, let's get a bunch of kids in August on hot tarmac and not have enough water.
Smart.
Yeah. So yeah, so the SAC base was there, and you know how in those days people took great pride in the fact that he said our town would be one of the first. We were high on the list of the towns the Russians would bomb.
I wrote about this just a few weeks ago. Yeah,
Yeah. I remember that.
my
And
hometown, we had an Air Force training base there, and our legend
so
was we were like number 11 or something.
we had reason to believe. I mean, it was a SAC base,
Yeah,
so and every Friday at noon in my town, air raid sirens would sound
yeah.
just as it was a test. And I grew up in fear that those wily Ruskies would attack us at noon on a Friday and we would be caught.
With your pants down. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Um,
during the period when you're growing up, in the sort of 1950s, early 1960s, that kind of immediate post-war era is culturally really very interesting to me because it was, I think, really the apex of prestige of big organizations.
yeah,
Federal government, certainly big business. There was this, you'll be familiar with the ideas of Frederick Winslow Taylor, of course, given
yeah,
what you've done. And but there was this. He was a guy who his thing was so-called scientific management, and the idea that business problems, economic problems, social problems, government problems could all be solved, or at least very, very thoroughly managed by applying essentially the scientific method to them, which I think is nonsense, but it was a big idea. And but having watched the federal government mobilize the way it did in World War II and execute its program in World War II um, in such an impressive and effective seeming way. Although, if you really drill down into it, there was all sorts of profiteering and war contracts and inefficiency and waste
sure.
and all the rest of the stuff you would expect. But we had just done this big thing as a big national project, and there were other big things coming out of it. The space program, NASA, the science departments at universities were the place to be. And you were a youngster who was good at math and science.
Yeah.
And so it seems to you at that point, I have to assume that you've got a very specific kind of career in front of you. That if you've got those kinds of talents, there's really hardly any question of doing anything else. And so you become an engineer and you don't like it.
I didn't like it, and I kind of knew going into it that I didn't really want to do it, but it was just in the air.
So you studied engineering as an undergraduate where?
I studied aerospace engineering at Notre Dame
Mm-hmm.
as an undergraduate, and knew I didn't want to do it, but I did it.
And you would have
And
graduated in what, 71, 72?
72. I can remember my senior design project. We had we had to design a private jet, a
Mm-hmm.
Learjet class of airplane, and so that involved doing some calculations and turning in the numbers on some form that the professor gave us. We also had to do uh, mechanical drawings, blueprints of the jet itself, but also the cross section of the airfoil, the wing. That was part of the thing. And I can remember the day that the professor handed the papers back to us. We turned them in bound, and because it was a big deal. There's all these drawings and a lot of papers. They were bound in a notebook that we had turned them in on. And he went around the room and dropped it on each person's desk, made a few comments, and he got to me, and he said he was from the South, and he said, "Mr. Guaspari, first of all, your drawing of an airfoil looked more like a turd to me." And I didn't say it, but I said, "Well, cross sections of airfoils do look kind of like turds," but I didn't say it. I didn't say it. And he said, "And your airplane was aerodynamically unstable." Now, what that means in English is that it can fly just fine unless there's the slightest perturbation in pitch or yaw or roll. And once there's a perturbation, there's nothing to steady it. It will just keep getting worse and worse and break apart. So he said it was aerodynamically unstable, which means your plane could just fly just fine in a vacuum if airplanes could fly in vacuums, which I thought was a very nice put down.
That's
So I didn't
great.
get a very good grade on that, but I got
You would have been an undergraduate in aerospace engineering when the moon
I
landing.
graduated in 72 and the moon landing was in 69. Yeah.
So there must have been a real sense of mission.
On my part?
Well, I would think just in the department among the other undergraduates, it'd be like
Yes.
studying Russian at the height of the Cold War, or being a Middle Eastern specialist around 9/11 or something like that.
Yeah.
It would have been something that would seem very, very urgent in life, I would think.
There were many of them who really did feel that. There were a number of guys who were in ROTC who were very much felt that. I didn't feel it. I mean, I was very interested in the space program as a viewer and as an observer and as an American, but I just kind of knew I didn't want to do that.
Hmm.
But I got out. I graduated and I had really good grades and did really well on the GREs and I didn't know what to do, so I went to graduate school and I studied it again because why not? And
And then you worked for an engineer for only 2 years. Is that right?
yeah, I decided I ought to try it, and I wasn't any good at it. And it was clear to me I wasn't any good at it. And I did, it was possible to show, wisdom at when you're 25, 26. I did. I realized, I said, look, I don't want to wake up in 5 years and discover that I have a wife and small kids, and I'm trapped in a career that I can't quit now. So I quit, and I decided to try and be a writer.
Hmm.
And
And so instead of moving to New York like a smart person, you moved to Boston.
I already was in Boston.
Okay.
I had already moved to Boston to get. I moved to Boston when I knew I could get a job as an engineer in Rome, New York. I moved to Boston after I got out of school, and first thing I ever wrote got published in National Review, and I thought this is easy.
And you got that big National Review money.
I got that $75,
That's
and
still what they pay, I'm pretty sure. I think.
yeah, that's probably. David Brudnoy was instrumental. He was very nice and gave me some good advice. And I still have it as we're speaking. On the wall right over here to my left, about 4 feet away, is a little baby blue postcard with National Review's letterhead, and it says, "Mr. Guaspari, nice going, WFB." And
Very nice. What was the
it's
article
been
about?
on the. This would have been in early 1975. Nixon had resigned in August of 74. Ron Ziegler was Nixon's press secretary.
Mm-hmm.
So Ziegler was kicking around, going around giving talks, and the BU School of Journalism invited Ziegler to come give a talk. And the students were up in arms. What today would be called, they wanted to cancel him.
Yeah.
And so there's a big brouhaha about him coming to give a talk. The administration still wanted him to speak. And they finally said, there'll be an open forum on the issue of whether or not Ron Ziegler ought to be allowed to come and talk. So it was an open forum. So I went and I attended and I took notes and I wrote about it and I sent it in to them. It was clear what was going to happen. I mean, imagine, Kevin, it was back 51 years ago, but yes, exactly what you imagine got said in that open forum got said in that open forum.
Yeah.
And, on that last line, the thing was, once again, Kenmore Square has been made safe for democracy. That was the last line of what I wrote. Yeah. And, and so I realized that I got a few other things published, but not enough. And so that's when I decided to try and get a job in corporate America marrying some technical aptitude with some writing ability, and I got a job with Honeywell writing as a promotional writer. And then I went to work for that company we talked about earlier, the ATM company.
Mm-hmm.
But at Honeywell, the most important thing at Honeywell is where I met my future wife. So that was the best job I ever had. But it was while I was at the ATM company and my book hit, and I was getting phone calls. Do you do speeches? And I was saying, no, I don't, that I got laid off. And all of a sudden, we had moved into a big new house with a big new mortgage. And I had a newly big wife because she was 7 months pregnant. And I had no job.
Mm.
And the next day I got a phone call. Do you do speeches on this? And I said, yes, I do.
And here's my rate.
And I was one of those people who was petrified at the thought of speaking in public. And I realized I had no choice.
Amazing what you can do when you have no choice.
Well, but I mean, you know, how the world works. I mean, it really is the case. This is one of those moments in life where you say, I got to do it. Yeah. And I could look at it as, oh my God, this is awful, or what an opportunity I'm being handed here if I just get over myself. And I did. And I went on the road and started delivering speeches and did that for a long time. And after doing it for a while, my publisher, which was the American Management Association, and their core business was seminars, said, you know, we could put you on the road delivering a seminar, but we need to know this week, because this was August, we got to go to press with our catalog. This was back in the old analog days. Mm-hmm. Physically print a catalog, mail it out to people. And we need you to come up with a one-day description of what the seminar might be. And I'm thinking, I have no idea what a seminar might be like. I have no godforsaken idea what this might be. And I said to them, yes, I'll do it. And I'll have you that description by the end of the week. Same thing. So I wrote something up that sounded substantive enough, but was vague enough that gave me enough wiggle room. And I had some friends in the Boston area who were in high enough places in their companies where I could call them and say, hey, how would you like a TQM seminar for free? It'll be a beta test, you know, full disclosure, I'm trying this out, but if you can deliver me 30 people or so, I'll give you a seminar. It might be a little rough around the edges, and they let me do it. And I had 3 or 4 runs at it before I went out and that worked well. And one thing led to another. And after doing that for about 4 years of many a week of 5 cities in 5 days, which was a real grind on me and also on my wife, who was at home with 2 small kids. Do you know anything what that's like? Do you know anything about what that's like, having small kids at
home? Some experience.
Yeah. And, you know, we kind of had a come to Jesus discussion and said, okay, I'll and so in a very, very small corner of the world, I had gained some notoriety. So there were a couple of companies in the Boston area who were recruiting me to work for them, consulting companies. So I went to work for one of them and worked for them for 5 years and gained some real honest to God consulting experience, which was a new thing for me because all I'd been doing was speaking and teaching a seminar. Yeah. And in the meantime, while on the road and while in hotel rooms, writing, I wrote a regular column for Quality Digest, which I jokingly would say to people, it's a magazine that is not as interesting as it sounds. I had a regular space in across
Cato
the board.
Has a magazine that's called Regulation.
I'm sorry?
I think it's Cato that has a magazine that's called Regulation.
Oh, that sounds worse. There's the conference board's flagship magazine was called Across the Board. I had a regular column in that. So I regularly get published. That's how I kept my name out there, which got, And by then I'd written a couple of more books, and the whole flywheel kept turning. But that going to work for the consulting company cut down my travel by about 85%. And so that was better for me, better for my wife, better for the family, all that got better. But then I eventually went back out on my own again, because I'd learned about consulting and I'd learned how I could balance. I didn't have to frenetically go out and give speeches all the time to earn money. I could do consulting work where I didn't have to be out there every day. And I'd always told my wife that before I retired, I wanted to get a job as an employee of a real company to see if I could actually, if you excuse the expression, to see if I believe my own bullshit. See if it took. It's one thing to go and work with somebody as a consulting basis. Work inside a company where you don't have there's the old expression in consulting that the expert is the guy with the airplane ticket in his pocket, where you sort of automatically have some cachet because you're coming in from outside. I'm just another jabroni who works there, and I got to influence people. And, if you'll allow me, I think it's an interesting story of how I got this job. The last 10 years of my career, I worked for Raytheon, which was a big company, a government contractor, and a government defense contractor. So that's like the trifecta of tough challenges for doing the kind of influence work that I was talking about. But I've been in, like, I don't know, March, April of 2004, I got a call from somebody at Raytheon. Hey, we're doing our big quality conference. They still did big quality conferences in October. We need a speaker to talk about customer focused quality. Do you still do that stuff? Yes, I do. Can you come to our meeting in Dallas on thus and such a date? Sure, fine, done. So come October of 2004, now I know you're not a big sports fan, but by any chance, might you remember what might have been significant, especially significant to Boston sports in 2004? October of 2004?
No idea.
Okay.
Is it a World Series?
It was the year the Red Sox finally won the World Series after 86 years of not having won it. Okay. Now, Raytheon it's a worldwide company, but it's largely a New England and Boston-based company. It's actually not even Raytheon anymore. It's Raytheon Technologies or RTX, or I don't know. There have been some mergers and stuff. I don't know. But so it's largely a Boston-based company. So the meeting was in Dallas, but there was a large contingent from New England and the Boston area. I was scheduled to speak. It was supposed to be an after-dinner talk, Dallas time, 7 o'clock to 7:45. First pitch of the World Series, which was being played in Boston, was at 8:35 Eastern time, or 7:35 Dallas time. My talk was on customer-focused quality. So I got up to talk, and the first thing I said was, I want to see the first pitch as much as you do. I will be done by 7:30. And I got a huge ovation, and before I had said more than those first 15 words. And I finished my talk at 7:30. I said, thank you very much for your time and your attention. Go Red Sox, go have a beer. And I turned to my host who was sitting next to me, the guy who invited me. I said, I hope that was all right. He said, no, that was perfect. That was fine. And he said, let's go get a beer. And we went in the bar to watch the game. And he said, what are you up to? I said, actually, I'm looking for a job. And a week later, I was hired. But it was just an example of how by that time, I think partly it was because I was an old coot by then, and I'd been around enough that I was completely comfortable in my own skin, and I felt comfortable doing that kind of thing. And whereas early in my career, I'd have been petrified to change a comma in what I prepared to talk about, and
Sure.
so
Did
anyway.
did you have summer jobs and stuff when you were a kid?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Tell me about
Um,
the best one of those,
the the
or the worst
best
if it's a
one,
better story,
the worst.
or the worst if it's a better story.
Well, the worst is real short. I worked the worst was I was hired by the county, told to show up at the county barn at 7:30 on some Monday morning, and they told me to get in the truck and go out with these guys to whatever the work site was, and they threw some coveralls at me and a mask and a hard hat and goggles, and I found out I was to paint the underside of a bridge, and I am deathly afraid of heights.
Not
So I sucked it up for that day, but that was the end of that job. So
the
that
job
was,
painting
and then
bridges.
that was the best summer job I ever had, and I had it from the summer of my senior year in high school, I think all through my college years. I took the civil service exam, and I worked for the post office as my title was temporary substitute letter carrier.
Hmm. So
Letter carrier, not mailman. I'm sorry.
So you were a mailman.
Yeah, but you couldn't say that. But yes.
You're a deputy mailman.
Well, actually, the mailman, letter carrier were the people who it was their route. They carried the same route every day,
Mm-hmm.
day in, day out.
And why was that the best job?
Well, it became the best job because the temporary substitute is I would show up each day and fill in for somebody who was sick or vacation, and I'd just get a different route each day. I'd have no idea where the thing was. I'd get lost each day, and that part was bad. Then I caught a good break. The guy who was the regular on the route on which my family happened to live had a heart attack, and he was fine. And a few months later, he returned to work. But they needed somebody to fill in for the summer, and they said, "Well, give it to Guaspari. He lives on the route." I'm not sure of the logic of that, but I wasn't going to argue. And so I got my own route as a temporary substitute. So it was like a battlefield promotion. And after just a couple of weeks, I was like a regular. I was flying around. I could sort the mail like anybody. And the way it works at the post office, you go in at 7 in the morning, you sort the mail till 9. You go deliver the mail at 9. At 3 o'clock, you return to turn in your bag and your keys, and then you come back the next day. After a few weeks, I could start delivering the mail at 9. I'd be done by 11:30, and the route finished right across the street from where we lived. I go home, change clothes, call a buddy. We go play tennis for 2 or 3 hours. Then I go home, change back, go to the post office. And it was one of the first things occurred to me that maybe this isn't as efficiently designed as it could be. And
Ladies and gentlemen, civil service.
I had to be careful, whom I asked about this. But I did. Is this really the way it ought to be? And they said, "Well, it's designed this way because in the winter, because this is upstate New York, in the snow, you can't go that fast." Might you not have routes that were like from April to November, and then other routes from? Oh, that's not the way it's done. So I quickly understood that I should shut up. But it was just an quick look into some jobs have inefficiencies built in, which actually I was able to use that story later on when I was consulting around process improvement and process inefficiencies.
We began by talking about processes, and now I guess we're ending by talking about processes. So now that you're sort of semi-retired, what's your one thing you still want to do with your writing life or your professional life before you totally play golf and tennis all day?
I can't play tennis anymore because of various physical ills. I my golf game stinks, so I'll probably throw my clubs into a dumpster sometime soon. Uh, Professionally, I don't want to. I have a new book coming out soon, and it's the last business book I'll ever write because I don't have anything left to say. Uh,
What's it called?
it's called "If Engagement is the What, Then Respect is the How," and it's basically the employee engagement is a big deal. You need to get your employees engaged if you want to be effective, and there's all kinds of hoo-ha about how you do that. And basically, I'm saying, look, the key to making that happen is, homely as this sounds, is it would be helpful if you respect people. If people respect people, that will get you about 85% of the way there. And just, I mean, I started out writing a very short book, and this one is very short because I don't see any point in larding it up with a lot more than that. So that's what it's about. And this might sound very Pollyanna-ish or whatever, but if it helps some people, I'll be happy. I don't care. Well, would I like it to make some money? Sure, but I just, if people say, "Hey, I read your book and it was helpful," that will be nice. That I will be pleased. I don't. I I want to keep writing. I write for general interest now, like the stuff I've written for the Dispatch, and just some book reviews. I write about sports a lot because I'm interested in it. Um, every now and then, I think maybe I have a novel in me, but I don't know that that's ever going to happen. And I suspect that anybody who ever says, "I don't know that that's ever going to happen," when it comes to a novel, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, but I'm busy. I belong on the board of the country club where I play, and that keeps me busy. And that's, it doesn't pay me anything, but it's noble work. I mean, I think I'm of service, and you know, and I
think
have two adult children.
I think it was St. Augustine who said there is no work more noble than country club management.
That's it. That's exactly. It was St. Augustine or Arnold Palmer, one or the other. Yeah.
John Guaspari, TQM guru, best-selling writer, and country club guy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. I enjoyed it.
That concludes our most recent episode of How the World Works. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with John Guaspari as much as I did. There'll be a link in the show notes to YouTube where you can watch a video of the interview if you are so inclined. And we'll be back next month with another episode. Thanks for watching.